incredibly thrilled to be here today to talk to everyone about the diversity landscape, especially as it applies to boards. Okay, so the bottom line is that if we want to close the gender, power, wealth, and funding gap in this country, we need, and in the world, we need to get women a seat at the table. But that actually isn't enough. Also, companies of all sizes, small companies, large companies, certainly public companies, they all need to understand the economic case for diversity. Diversity at the board level, it's an imperative. It's an economic imperative, or at least it should be. Okay, so we should not have to make this case, the economic case for diversity, but we do over and over. So here we go. There's a lot of words on this slide, but the headline is that diversity pays. In fact, according to McKinsey, some of you might be familiar with this study, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity, and this is at the board level, at the executive level, they were 21% more likely to outperform when it comes to profitability and 27% more likely to have higher value creation. Now, conversely, companies that were in the lower quartile for gender diversity at the board level were 29% less likely to achieve above average profitability than were all the other companies in the data set. So again, the headline, diversity pays. Now, while things have indeed improved, the statistics are still bleak. So make no mistake, the vast majority of private and public company directors in this country are white men. Nothing against white men, just is what it is. Now, the data is much, much harder to access for private companies, and this is because private companies have little or no obligation to report it. A recent first of its kind study, and this is only recent, there's only been, I think, 2 now, that looked at 500 venture-backed private companies found that only 14% of those board seats were held by women. And the thing is that there are, in fact, between 10 to 20 million private companies out there, but we only have stats for 500. So it's important to put that in perspective and let that sink in. We really just don't have very much visibility into this. And according to Equilar, there is, in fact, a direct correlation between company size and gender diversity on boards. So what this means is that the highest percentage of female directors are actually concentrated on the boards of the larger companies, like the ones who self-selected to be part of this study. So what that means is that, in fact, smaller companies, of which there are many, they tend to miss out on the value that diversity at the board level brings that company. This is not great for companies, but this is also not great for the board candidate pipeline because there's way fewer board opportunities than there actually need to be. One other thing that is very important to point out, fewer than 5% of board seats in this study were held by women of color. This data set, in fact, included more board seat participants with the name David or Dave than there were women of color in the entire study. I'm not making this up. Simply having a seat at the table, it doesn't necessarily promise equity in the workplace, and this is literally. While women accounted for almost a quarter of the top executives in S&P 500 companies in 2020, studies show that they only controlled around 1% of the value of shares held among their fellow corporate leaders. And in fact, the gender pay gap among top executives got bigger in 2020. And these differences, of course, only dramatically increased for women of color. Now, this slide gives you a sense of what it's like to raise a venture fund as a woman in America these last few years. The red, those are the women. Okay, so what can we do? How can change be implemented? In 2018, some of you might be aware of the monumental legislation that California passed that requires public companies headquartered in the state to have an equal number of women to men in their boardroom composition by 2021. Now, while the law was in fact ultimately struck down under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which we could talk about for an hour, I'm a lawyer, I would love to, but I can't because I only have 4 minutes. What the passage of that bill did was create a national conversation. So we're having that conversation right now in this room. We're going to have that conversation with this panel discussion that we're going to have in a few minutes, and it's happening everywhere, and that is really important. Additionally, more and more institutions have taken notice of this conversation and they're acting. So, for example, NASDAQ, I know NASDAQ is here today, and Goldman Sachs both require leadership diversity when companies are seeking to go public. Now, these moves have created a massive market for quote unquote qualified women candidates in the short term. Now, of course, globally, other countries have taken much bigger steps in closing the gender pay and wealth gaps. In the EU, for instance, they passed historic legislation recently that requires all large companies to have a board composition of at least 40% women by June 2026. So I think the headline here is that the tide is turning and it will catch up to the United States eventually. And when it does, everyone in this room is going to have a head start.